our Zoom guests to join as well. It usually takes a minute or two for everyone to trickle in. So bear with us while we have a little moment of quiet while our other attendees join us. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Priyanka Modoparthi, and I direct the project on armed conflict, counterterrorism, and human rights at Columbia Law School. Thank you for attending today's event. Some of you are here in person, our Columbia Law School students, and we also have a great audience joining us through Zoom that will be joining us virtually. This is the second event in our speaker series, our event series, 20 years after 9/11, addressing an enduring legacy of harm. Today's event addresses civilian impacts in the global war on terror, US drone strikes and counterterrorism operations in Somalia. The US government has been conducting aerial attacks in Somalia since at least 2007 and carried out its first drone strike there on June 23rd, 2011. Since that time, it has shifted and expanded operations, going from apparently targeting high-level operatives of al-Qaeda to targeting a wide range of individuals allegedly associated with the violent extremist group al-Shabab. The Biden administration paused these strikes soon after taking office. The strikes in Somalia resumed this summer, and they reportedly did so without explicit sign-off from the White House. It is extremely difficult for independent groups to verify these strikes and to establish their civilian impact, but some of our panelists today have done an invaluable job making contributions, helping the public understand what the impact of these operations have been on ordinary Somalis, particularly those living in al-Shabab controlled areas. Today's discussion will explore questions around why the US government is conducting military operations in Somalia. What are some of the impacts these operations have on Somalis? We'll discuss what responsibility the US military has taken and has failed to take for civilians killed in these operations in Somalia. Finally, we'll explore the legal basis for US operations there and some of the criticisms of this approach. We'll start the event with introductory remarks from each of our speakers, and then I'll ask some follow-up questions. After that, we'll have time for audience questions, first from our in-person audience and then from our online audience. Our in-person audience can ask questions by raising their hand, and when I call upon you, you can use your microphone to speak. Please do remember to turn it off after you're done asking your question. Our online audience can submit questions via the Zoom Q&A function. Lastly, just a housekeeping note, we will have lunch available for those attending in person. These are takeaway lunches that'll arrive towards the end of the event. So thank you in advance for just claiming those discreetly out of respect for our speakers. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. So first of all, with us here in person, it's my great pleasure to have you here in person with us today, is Abdullahi Hassan. Abdullahi Hassan was the Somalia researcher for Amnesty International for several years, where he investigated and wrote reports on civilian deaths, injuries, and other impacts of US drone and airstrikes in Somalia. He previously worked for Human Rights Watch. He is currently an LLM student at Columbia Law School, which is why he's able to be with us in person today. Second, we have with us on Zoom, Abdifatah Hassan Ali. Abdifatah, are you able to turn on your video so our audience can briefly see you? Thank you. Abdifatah is a Somali human rights advocate and expert. He is a founder of the Somali digital rights group, Digital Shelter, and has held a wide range of other leading human rights roles in the country. including extensive work with displaced populations. He's also a blogger and has written for publications, including the online national security forum, Just Security, on how the US government has responded to civilian deaths and injuries in Somalia. He is joining us today from Mogadishu. And so due to a less strong internet connection, he will turn on his video when he's able to do so, but may need to turn it off at other times. But we're very lucky to be able to have this kind of hybrid event where we have so many students joining us in person. We have our own LLM student joining us as well to speak with us in person. We have experts joining us from all over the world, including from Mogadishu. Next, I'd like to introduce Amanda Sperber. Amanda is an experienced investigative journalist who has shown a deep commitment, one I truly admire, to challenging in-country reporting in Somalia, an expertise she has deepened over many years. She has written for prominent outlets, including Vice News, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and The Nation. She has focused much of her reporting on the impact of US operations in Somalia and interviewed many families impacted by US airstrikes. She's joining us today, I think, from Tanzania. Is that right, Amanda?
Sorry, trip didn't happen. I'm in New York.
Oh, okay. Such is the life of a journalist. Okay, that's good. You're here in New York. Next, we have Brian Finucane. Brian is a senior analyst in the US program of the International Crisis Group, which works to develop policies promoting peace around the world. He has written extensive analyses of US policies, including legal positions related to its operations in Africa. Before joining Crisis Group, Brian served as an attorney advisor in the US Department of State's Office of the Legal Advisor. So thank you all so much for joining us. Abdullahi, I'd like you to start us off by giving us an overview of how US operations in Somalia, US military operations in Somalia have impacted civilians, sharing some of the work that you've done.
Thank you so much. Yes, I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much, Priyanka, for the introductions and for having us to have this very important discussion. So I wanted to focus on two elements of the impact of the US airstrike in Somalia. And the first one is the impact, the civilian casualties that are resulting from these airstrikes. And the other one is the general other, the other impact related to, war and US military operations in Somalia in general. That's not mainly reported by either human rights researchers or, journalists. And initially, as Priyanka said, Somalia is a country that has been in conflict for the past 30 years. The current conflict is between the armed group al-Shabab, which the US military, which the US government designated as a terrorist group on one hand, and the Somali government forces which is supported by AMISOM, an African Union mission in the country, and international actors such as the military, the US military. And then on the other side, so this conflict is between these two parties, and the US military has been involved in supporting the Somali government against al-Shabab for many years. As Priyanka said, the first US airstrike was carried out in 2011. But then in 2017, President Trump issued a directive that declared large parts of Somalia an area of active hostilities, which gave the US military personnel the latitude to carry out more and more airstrikes with less scrutiny. And this led to, a lot of allegations of civilian harm. Since 2017, the US military carried out over 200 airstrikes. That is a dramatic increase from, how these airstrikes were carried out in the previous pre-Trump period. And this resulted to a lot of allegations of civilian casualties. So in 2018, at Amnesty International, we started to receive a lot of civilian allegations, and we decided to investigate some of these cases. In our investigations, we looked into only 6 airstrikes, only 9 airstrikes, because we cannot investigate 200 airstrikes. That number is just very huge. So we investigated only nine airstrikes. And up to that point, the US military kept saying they were only killing al-Shabab members and terrorists in these attacks. they said they killed 0 civilians, they injured 0 civilians throughout that period. But then to actually understand the truth and what was going on, we investigated these 9 cases. And we found, until this point, we found that 21 civilians were killed and 11 were injured. That's a total of 32 civilian casualties. But actually, other groups are saying the number is likely much higher. And you can imagine if we found 9 cases, if we found 32 civilian casualties from only 9 cases, the number is highly, likely. It's likely higher than this. Other organizations such as AWOS, a non-profit organization that also tracks civilian, the U.S. military actions in the world, including Somalia, they're estimating over 130 civilian deaths during this period. So that is an estimate they're giving, but then actually many Somalis and other people will tell you this number is likely higher than that. So who are these people who are getting killed? These are ordinary Somalis. Some of them are ordinary Somalis. Some of them are men who are not members of al-Shabab, who are not participating in any hostilities, who are not participating in any active hostilities. And in some cases, who are staying in their homes. Some of them are women. Some of them are children. As one of the victims is a young girl who was 3 years old. So clearly, the U.S. military was killing civilians, was harming civilians, but then they were denying that they were harming civilians. So after a lot of scrutiny from Amnesty International and from other independent groups, such as the investigative journalists we have on the panel, like Amanda, the U.S. military started acknowledging some of these, civilian harms. And before I get into what the number they have admitted so far, I want to describe one case so that our audience will understand who these people are. In February 2020, there was an attack in Jilib town, in a town called Jilib, in Middle Juba region in Somalia, where a family of 5 members, a man called Kuso Umar, his elderly mother, who is over 70 years old, and 3 daughters were sitting down for dinner in the evening, just enjoying their dinner in their home. And then they were hit by a US airstrike that destroyed part of their house, that also killed one of the daughters of Kuso instantly. That attack also seriously injured his elderly mother and his 2 other daughters. One of his daughters is currently in Mogadishu and is having, medical complications resulting from that airstrike and injuries she suffered from that airstrike. But what did the U.S. military say in response to that? The following morning, they issued a statement, as usual, to say we killed 1 terrorist in Jilib. That was outrageous. People were very angry, and those are some of the claims and some of the allegations we received, which actually led us into investigating more and understanding more. So that is one of the cases we investigated, which the U.S. military initially said they killed a terrorist. But then after our investigations, we found that those were not terrorists, actually a young 18-year-old girl and an elderly woman and 2 other, young girls were killed. Only all the civilians who were harmed in that attack were women, basically, who are not members of al-Shabab, who are not. In early 2020, the U.S. military now started a process where they issued quarterly reports, civilian casualty assessment reports, and in the first one they admitted to, causing civilian harm. That was the first time. We were all very happy because that's what we wanted. But then, how many civilian harm did they admit? They only admit, up to this point, they only admitted 13 civilian casualties, which is more than the 0 they were saying, but then which does not represent the actual figure and number. The family of Kuso is the 4 individuals who were impacted by that airstrike. is one of these 13 civilians. This include 5 killings and 8 injuries so far. So that is in terms of, I'm sure the other panelists will be talking about the impact of touch on an element that is not widely discussed. So when I was interviewing people impacted by these airstrikes, you hear a lot of stories that are saddening. For example, as a result of this airstrike, people have a lot of fear. They don't know. People, especially who live in al-Shabab controlled areas, they don't know what is going to happen next. So people are just fleeing. They're just leaving their homes. They just leaving their homes and farms and their work, and they're moving to IDP camps, internally displaced camps, in big cities, in Mogadishu and in other cities of the country. And when they reach there, they still face a lot of violations. The sexual harassment, lack of access to healthcare, and all other forms of human rights violations. So that is one thing they will tell you. Many will tell you some of the people killed their sole breadwinners. So they actually don't know who else to provide for them. So they lose livelihood in the process. And then others are also suffering from the injuries, are victims and suffering from these injuries and don't have money or the means to get access to medical care, and they're suffering in different parts of the country. So these are some of them, their farms have been destroyed. Some of them, their houses have been destroyed, so they don't have where to live. These are other impacts of this U.S. military operation that is not widely reported. And I think I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdullahi. Next, I'll turn to Abdifatah. Thank you for joining us. I know it's the evening for you in Mogadishu. You've written about how difficult it is for families whose loved ones are killed or hurt in these operations to actually report incidents. Can you share some of your experiences speaking with those families and working on that, as well as any thoughts you have on the long-term impact of these strikes?
Thank you very much, Priyanka. I hope you can hear me very well. And good evening and good morning for everyone on the Western Hemisphere. It's already evening for us, and I am privileged to join this session. I would like to thank the organizers, the Columbia University Human Rights Institute, Priyanka, and everyone else who was involved in this amazing platform. And I think Abdullahi has already covered pretty much on the impact of civilian of these airstrikes on civilians. But I am based in Mogadishu, Somalia, and I have seen victims affected by these strikes throughout my work, throughout my field visit in the IDP camps. And it was really very difficult for us, local civil societies and media, to actually go and report from the actual sites of these strikes. But meeting with all those displaced people who were affected by the strikes actually were enough for us to see the scale of the impact. We know that AFRICOM has developed an online reporting mechanism, for instance, recently as part of its commitment. But it was very difficult for everyone, for most of the communities that live in other parts of outside the capital city, to even have access to internet. So there were some complications and challenges of accessing the platform itself. The website was not actually adequately translated, and it was very difficult for let alone people who are not digitally native, but also people who are literally even who have literacy problem on how they could access these platforms. So another thing is the reporting mechanism. Apart from the digital platform, the general reporting mechanism was even very difficult, and people are there's no mechanism at all where people can directly report on civilian, whenever civilian is harmed by these strikes. And another point is also lack of political will from the government of Somalia to actually involve in the process, especially in developing proper reporting mechanism where civilians who have been affected can directly report their compliance. On another, I think the other point actually, which is very important, which we need to look at, is who are the affected communities. As you know, Somalia is divided in clan lines, and they are classes. So the marginalized communities, the most discriminated communities, are the most affected groups of these airstrikes. So it even makes more complicated for them to come forward and report because they don't have access, they don't have mechanism, they don't have the skills or experience or even techniques of reporting mechanism whenever there's strikes happen in their areas. Another thing is, so I think those are the problems with the reporting mechanism. Generally, the reporting mechanism is very difficult for civilians to access directly to US government, and this lack of political awareness from the government. And this digital platform they've developed is not actually convenient, is not applicable to the local context, because this is a community that doesn't have access to internet at all. In some parts of the country, internet is completely prohibited by the terrorist group. So it's even very difficult for people to access basic internet connection, let alone report it to about civilian casualties of any airstrikes. I think I'll stop it there and pass it.
Thank you so much, Abdifatah. So we've spoken a lot thus far about how difficult it is for families to make these reports when loved ones are killed or injured, how the US government and the general public likely has an inadequate understanding, how there's a likely undercounting of civilian casualties in Somalia. But Amanda, you've recently interviewed several families whose loved ones the US government has already admitted to having killed or injured, and in some cases apologized for what they've done. Can you tell us more about what you found while doing this reporting, and how those families are dealing with the aftermath of these tragedies?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Just wanted to quickly tangentially comment on something that Abdullahi had said. My volume wasn't working at one point, so you might have already said this, but something I didn't hear you say, which I think is important to note, is that it's very unclear what the definition of combatant is. So again, if you said this, shut me off. But one of the issues with the potential undercount is that we don't know. Right now, the US has only admitted to, bar one person, has only admitted to killing women and children, which implies that they may be treating all military-aged males, which is as combatants, which could then really distort the civilian casualty count. And in a place like Somalia, the al-Shabab is really interwoven into a lot of the fabric of society, for better or worse. So because of that, you have a situation where, if you're, depending on who you're considering a member of al-Shabab, you're treating a large swath of the population as combatants, which is certainly problematic, for lack of a better word. And then I guess specifically, I was in Mogadishu in April, as Abdullahi pointed out. The first US strike in Somalia took place in 2007. After 14 years of strikes, the US has taken responsibility for 4 incidents of civilian casualties, 3 involving civilian deaths and injuries, and 1 with injuries, no deaths. I went to Mogadishu and spoke with 3 of the 4 families of those killed, of relatives of those killed by the US military. They all said that none of them had heard personally from the US government or received a condolence payment. I also spoke with several former Somali officials who worked closely with the US government, US Africa Command, and the CIA. None could recall participating in substantive conversations about how to manage cases of confirmed civilian casualties, including 7 former security advisors and intelligence chiefs who held their positions during or after the Trump administration relaxed the rules to prevent civilian casualties. What I heard from the families was largely a few things. One, I think there's a kind of a stereotype that people who want money from civilian casualties are opportunistic and kind of seeing the US government as a wealthy entity that could help them. And I think something that I found was both that when you lose a member of a family to an airstrike and it's an accident, you've often have like real costs to it, the same way that anybody would anywhere in the world, whether it's a funeral or losing someone who's contributing to the family financially or otherwise. So there's like there's substantive need for money that just exists because of what the US government did. And then beyond that, there's also injuries that are caused. In the case of the airstrike in Kismayo, near Kismayo, which Abdullahi spoke of, one of the girls who was there, who I met with her uncle in Mogadishu, she needs ongoing psychological care. And then the mother-in-law her hip is still so badly injured, she can't go to the bathroom without assistance. And they don't have the money to fly her to Mogadishu to get care. So there's real like substantive need for condolence payments. And then beyond that, like there's a sense that payments would provide a sense of recognition for what's been done wrong. And that while the government admitting to having killed civilians without contacting the families personally feels a bit performative, sort of like these public apologies allow them to say, oh, we're so much more accountable than other governments. But in reality, that's kind of a gaslighting situation where they're kind of saying they're better than everyone else for saying sorry, but that doesn't really have much behind it because they're not actually engaging with the families. And, if you've done something wrong, the painful conversation is the one that you have one-on-one, where you look someone in the eye and or at least call them on the phone. And it's much easier to make a public apology. So I think that was sort of what I found in speaking to families. And I'll leave it there.
And both of those points were very important to add to this discussion. So thank you for that. Brian, now I'm going to turn to you. You've written for Crisis Group on the legal basis for US operations in Somalia and elsewhere, actually, and how that has changed over time. Can you share that progression with regards to Somalia, as well as your view on where things stand?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you, Columbia, for having me here today. It's a pleasure speaking with you. The story of U.S. counterterrorism operations in Somalia is one of both mission creep and law creep. The expansion of the U.S. war in al-Shabab was enabled by creative lawyering within the U.S. executive branch. By way of background on the law, when the U.S. uses force, there are 2 possible domestic law bases for doing so. First, the president has some inherent authority under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution to use military force. The scope of this authority is contested, but it at least extends to defending the United States from attack and defending U.S. forces. The executive branch is also occasionally taking the position that the president has an inherent authority to use quote unquote collective self-defense in defense of foreign partner forces. The second potential domestic legal basis for using military force is congressional authorization, either in the form of a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force, an AUMF. Here, the relevant congressional authorization is the 2001 AUMF passed in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Now, the U.S. executive branch has interpreted the AUMF to apply not only to al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but also so-called associated forces. And associated forces is a term that does not appear in the text of the AUMF itself, but was essentially invented by the executive branch. An additional part of the legal background to bear in mind here is the War Powers Resolution. When the president uses force, relying only on his inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution, he must report such hostilities to Congress within 48 hours. In addition, any such hostilities must terminate within 60 days unless Congress authorizes them. So, turning to U.S. military operations in Somalia, during the Bush administration, the U.S. supported efforts by neighboring African countries and forces in Somalia, first to counter the Islamic Courts Union and later al-Shabab. However, direct U.S. military operations, U.S. direct action in Somalia was rare and limited to a small number of special forces raids and airstrikes targeting members of al-Qaeda in East Africa. When President Obama took office, the Pentagon made a move to expand the aperture. The Pentagon wanted to target al-Shabab as a whole and wanted the 2001 AUMF reinterpreted to allow them to do so. The Obama administration resisted, and instead they landed on a position where the 2001 AUMF would apply only to members of al-Shabab who also belong to al-Qaeda. And in practice, that's meant that the U.S. would only be targeting senior leaders of al-Shabab who were dual-hatted with al-Qaeda. And this is a relatively small number of strikes, what were termed high-value targets. But at the same time, the U.S. was conducting these occasional surgical, quote-unquote, surgical strikes on high-value targets. U.S. special operators were also on the ground in support of AMISOM and Somali forces opposing al-Shabab. Now, U.S. special operators were there in Somalia on the ground in ostensibly a non-combat role. Nonetheless, they were involved in combat. In 2015, the U.S. special operators were engaged in ground combat with al-Shabab and begun calling in airstrikes against al-Shabab foot soldiers under the guise of collective self-defense of their African partners. None of these hostilities were reported to Congress under the war, as required by the War Powers Resolution. It was only after U.S. forces had been engaged in such combat against al-Shabab that the Obama administration came to the conclusion that al-Shabab as a whole was covered by the 2001 AUMF. In other words, the U.S. was officially at war with the group as a whole. And the Obama administration reached this conclusion when it decided that al-Shabab was, quote unquote, an associated force of al-Qaeda, despite the fact that al-Shabab had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. This legal innovation paved the way for a dramatic expansion of the U.S. war in Somalia, first under the Obama administration, but then under the Trump administration. And the Trump administration, as previously noted, also lifted policy-based restrictions on U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, dramatically leading to a dramatic increase in the number of airstrikes during the 4 years of the Trump administration. Now, at the end of the Trump administration, of course, President Trump ordered the withdrawal of most, but not all, U.S. forces from Somalia, and there are still forces there today. And as previously noted, when President Biden took office, the National Security Council imposed a pause on U.S. direct action in Somalia, but there was a carve-out for, again, these collective self-defense strikes in support of partner forces. And we've seen a number of those strikes over the course of this summer.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to go ahead and ask you a follow-up question on your remarks. So help us understand, what is collective self-defense? Can you break it down in sort of the simplest terms? I mean, what are we to understand by this? Because your remarks make it sound like the US is engaging in military actions in Somalia that go far beyond what was contemplated by the 2001 authorization of military force, that go far beyond, even what many of us sitting in this room might imagine to be happening and to be the sort of scope of military operations in Somalia today. Can you help us understand that a little bit better?
Sure. So first off, it's necessary to understand what collective self-defense in this context is not. Many of you may be familiar with the concept of collective self-defense in international law. That is a state or states defending another state that is under attack. This was the case with respect to Kuwait in the immediate aftermath of the invasion by Iraq in 1990. Collective self-defense was invoked. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is a Department of Defense, US Pentagon term of art. And what it means is US forces defending a designated partner force from attack. Now, sometimes this occurs in contexts where the US and that partner force are working together against an entity which is clearly covered by the 2001 AMF, as may happen in the war in Afghanistan. But it also occurs in situations where the US is supporting a partner force, and that partner force may be fighting some entity which is not covered by the 2001 AMF. And that was the case that we in Somalia in 2015, where al-Shabab writ large was not covered by the 2001 AMF. Nonetheless, when African partner forces came under fire, the US forces would call in airstrikes in their defense. And in some cases, it appears that the US was essentially providing close air support for offensive operations by those partner forces.
Thank you, Brian. A note to our online audience, if you would like to ask questions of our panelists, please go ahead and put them into Zoom using the Q&A function. And if you would like to direct that to a specific panelist, then please do so. If not, I'll choose who it should go to. And then to our in-person audience, go ahead and prepare your questions. Well, let me just go ahead and ask, actually, if anyone has any initial questions. Okay, go ahead. And can you turn on your mic?
Yes. So if it's not collective self-defense as defined under international law, then under what authority is the US acting in its use of force? Because there are only two recognized exceptions: self-defense under Article 51 and UN Security Council authorization under Title 7, Chapter 7 rather.
Brian, I think that one's for you. Were you able to hear the question?
I did. Very good question. What I'm discussing are internal, both DoD terminology and operational concepts, and US domestic law authorizations. The international legal basis for US operations in Somalia is different. And the US has been conducting operations in Somalia for many years with the consent of the government of Somalia. So that's the international law basis. Now, in terms of how this operational concept of collective self-defense, as DoD defines it, how that maps onto domestic legal bases, it's often difficult to tell. Sometimes it could be that the US is relying on the 2001 AMF. Other times it could be relying on Article 2 of the Constitution, but it's often murky. And one of the problems, as we've seen in Somalia, was that these incidents of collective self-defense in 2015 and 2016 were not reported under the War Powers Resolution, and there was no public explanation for the purpose of these actions, nor their legal bases at the time.
Thank you, Brian. We have a question from one of our online guests, from Ahmed Hire. He says, "My name is Ahmed, and I'm one of the families affected by US airstrikes in Somalia. I would like to ask our panelists where our voice or where your advocacy has reached." Abdullahi, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to take that one.
Thank you for Ahmed for asking that question. I actually know Ahmed, so it's good that he joined our discussion today. So what happened is, after our investigations, we issued the report explaining how civilians were killed and injured by the US military, and presented a lot of evidence, including a lot of testimonies from people whose relatives and family members were killed. And in the process, a few things happened. Actually, part of our advocacy was, first of all, to get the US military to acknowledge this civilian harm they are causing in Somalia. And to some extent, I think that was a success, because the US military, as I said in my earlier remarks, in 2020, started issuing quarterly, civilian casualty assessment reports, where they started admitting civilian harm. And so far, they have admitted to 13 civilian casualties. That is number one. But of course, we are saying that is not the actual number. We want the US military to go ahead and do more assessment and investigation, admit to causing the actual harm they caused in Somalia. The second one is advocacy issue we had, is the issue of reporting of reporting mechanisms for these families. As Abdifatah discussed, when families are harmed by the US military actions, they usually don't have where to go. They don't know what to do, actually. They don't know who to report to. They don't know who to make these allegations to. So that's why most of the allegations are investigated by human rights researchers and journalists and other individuals and activists. So what we are trying to tell the US military is for them to be accountable by making sure they allow individuals, civilians in Somalia, have a mechanism to report these allegations of civilian harm. And as Abdifatah mentioned, so far the US military has set up a website where it's a portal, essentially, where civilians can report civilian harm. You just mention your name, where where you're writing from, what happened to your family member, and details like that. But then it's a link in some US military website, and it's very difficult for people to have access to this. One thing we wanted the US military to do is to come up with other reporting mechanisms which are easily accessible by people in Somalia who do not have access to internet and who do not know who do not have the know-how to navigate websites. For example, we were encouraging the US military to set up a physical office somewhere in Mogadishu where people can just walk in and report, or even set up a telephone, a toll number where people can just call and easily make reports of civilian harm. But then they have not done so, and we hope they will take action and set up other other mechanisms. But in terms of compensation to family members, apart from publicly admitting, the US military has not contacted family members. They, as Amanda explained, they are not offering any form of compensation to people. They are not, people are just suffering as a result of these attacks. It's our hope that the US military will reach out to these families, officially apologize to them directly, instead of just issuing statements for the sake of issuing them, and will also offer compensation to these family members. And I hope families like Ahmed will be able to have, able to access compensation from the US military going forward.
Thank you, Abdullahi. I'm going to ask Amanda the same question because it's such an important one. And Amanda, in your reporting, you've met with some of these families, and then you have gone to US policymakers, decision makers, and directly asked them some of these questions. So what are the types of answers you've received? Have you asked them if they're planning to compensate families or why they cannot? What are some of the other responses you've received when you've asked policymakers about this?
Sure. I guess I also want to add something that I think that's complicated about Somalia, and I assume many other countries in which the U.S. is conducting these type of military operations. However, I think it's it's especially extreme in Somalia, which is that the government does not advocate on behalf of civilians, which then, and if anything, there's been at least one civilian who was targeted by the government for publicly speaking out about civilian casualties that the US itself confirmed, and was targeted by the Somali government. So I think something that is complicated is that the US will often defer to the Somali government. Like the times that I've emailed with AFRICOM, they'll say, they'll kind of defer to the Somali government and say, well, you should ask them about, you know, what they've decided to do, or say, you know, and they'll kind of also defer to the Somali government to advocate on behalf of its civilians. But the Somali government does not, for a variety of reasons, a mixture of, you know, disorganization and not having time and having other pressing matters. And that's what I've been told. And also because there's a sense of, I think perhaps that there's a lack of kind of interest, and that the Somali government would be better suited to not kind of raising those issues. So I think that that's, you know, important to acknowledge, both in terms of the context in which this is happening, and also in terms of that this often gives the US government kind of an out, because they'll just say, oh, we'll go talk to them. At least that's what I've experienced as a journalist. My other understanding, kind of from background conversations, is that the US treats individual, I can't speak to the legality exactly of this, but essentially that there's a difference between admitting fault and apologizing, and that the US sees a personal apology as potentially kind of admitting fault in a way that a public acknowledgement does not. I can't really speak more to that, so I'll let others, but I think that there's an element of just a lot of legality in terms of how they frame their apologies.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Amanda. That's such an important point. The US government has acknowledged civilian casualties and they have apologized, but they have never admitted legal fault in doing so in Somalia, as far as I'm aware. Or indeed, I cannot think of an example in any country where they've admitted that type of legal fault, because of course that would come with very different consequences. Do we have any other questions from the room? Ooh, we have a lot. Okay. We have 12 minutes left. Okay, Johanna.
Thank you for our panelists for giving us a very great overview of the topic. I want to understand more what ordinary Somalis feel about the constant denial of the US on causing civilian casualties. Of course, they're admitting to few, but it's not enough. And I want to understand, if I may direct this to the Somalis in the panel, I want to ask if there was ever a moment where Somalis took these frustrations out to the streets and show the frustration towards the US government, and if there are any advocacy initiatives in Somalia currently.
Thank you so much. It's such an important question. And I'm going to just read out one of the questions from the online guests as well, because I think it relates quite closely to what you've asked. So we have Camilla Molinu, who works for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drones and Modern Conflict in the UK Parliament. And Camilla has asked if we can expand on the broader human cost of drone strikes, what that broader human cost looks like, including mental health, livelihood, family finances, children going to school, and what this looks like in the Somali context. So Abdifatah, I'm going to ask you to address both of these questions. In particular, what the response in Somalia has been, what that has looked like, and the broader human cost. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bianca. And this is very important question. Two things. People are frustrated, disappointed, and they're really helpless because they don't know how to report, where to report, and who to look for assistance or support in reporting these issues. So they are literally stuck. We've seen families who actually don't know what to do beyond this because they are already been affected by the strikes. They were displaced. Some of them have lost families. They don't have a platform or mechanism to either direct their compliance to the Somali government or US government. So it's completely complicated and frustrating situation for everyone. The second point about the protests and advocacy, no, there are no any protests or advocacy about these issues except small protests and outrage organized by sometimes some of the families of some of the communities affected by the strikes. So there are no, let's say, nationwide or mass protests or advocacy against this issue because of too many reasons. One of it I can say safety and security reasons. Not everybody wants to come out actually and publicly talk about these issues openly because of their safety and security reasons, not from the US government, but also from other entities in the country. But I also want to come back to the point of lack of the involvement of the federal government of Somalia, which is really even more frustrating and disappointing because we've been trying to push the Somali government to involve in the process of seeking compensation for these families, because in that case, two things will happen. Number one, US government will not use the excuse of not knowing, not giving their money to unverified or unknown compliance. And then also the second thing that will happen is that the compensation, actually the fact that the government of Somalia is involved in the process will give legitimacy to this compensation, and I'm sure it will save more lives if the government will have advocated this from long time, since the strikes have started. So, yeah, I would stop there.
So much, Abdifatah. I know we have some other questions. You start in the back in the yellow sweater.
Hi, thank you so much, panelists, for sharing up to this point. My question is, I've heard some mention of it, but I just want to get like an idea if you have one of what like a broader or kind of systemic form of reparation will look like for the country and for the victims. We've heard about, acknowledgement and apology and possible payments to individuals. But I think especially given the answers and the previous question, there may be kind of wider implications for the people as a group. And so, what would that look like for you if you can kind of sketch that out?
Thank you. And I think let's go ahead and take just one or two more questions and see if we can address them in bulk, given our limited time. Do you want to go ahead in the brown
Sure. Thank
sweater?
you very much for an illuminating discussion. My question is about the geopolitical context. We have touched upon the role of the federal government of Somalia's passive or counterproductive stance. What is the role of other nation states, such as Kenya, in sanitizing the US action in terms of blurring the legality, the legal framework? I know someone touched upon that, but perhaps just situating that within the geopolitical context would be something to be discussed, especially the role of Kenya in that role.
Thank you both so much for those questions. Abdullahi, I'm going to ask you to take a first crack at both of those. And the questions were, again, first of all, about the possibility of reparations, what that could look like, and second, the broader geopolitical context and specifically the role of Kenya as well.
Both are very good questions. To the reparation question, I think I will respond by saying all forms of reparations, will be necessary. One way is public apologies for all the attacks and all the casualties that are caused by these airstrikes, and also not only public but also contacting family members directly and apologizing to them. That I think is going to be very important, and also promising a repetition, because the U.S. military has been carrying this for for many years, and they have been killing people every year throughout this process. So they should be developing strategies and policies that prevents them from attacking and harming civilians. Committing to doing that is also very important. But from my research and from my engagement with Somalis themselves who are impacted by these airstrikes, they actually prefer compensation, monetary compensation. That is, and that's for many reasons, because compensation is a tool in Somalia that's used by different actors to bring about peace and reconciliation between communities. And there is the blood money principle that's used in Somalia. That's really very important in this context that the U.S. military seem not to understand. So they could also do this in kind, for example, in terms of making sure they take these people to hospitals, they cater for the medical bills and that kind of thing, or rebuilding their houses. So most of the Somalis, if you speak to them, that's what they tell you. In terms of the geopolitics, currently the geopolitics in the region, that is in East Africa, is really very complicated. So there are many things happening right now. Different entities and countries in the region are fighting for control and influence in the region, including in Ethiopia, in Somalia, and also in Kenya. And one thing that we need to understand is African mission in Somalia are basically troops from troop contributing countries in the region, including Kenya. So these are allies of the U.S. military and the Somali government when it comes to, fighting with al-Shabab. So it is very unlikely for the, for AMISOM or other entities to actually condemn or follow up on a U.S. military airstrikes in Somalia. On the other hand, AMISOM itself is actually committing similar violations. For example, as recent as this August, AMISOM forces are being accused of killing 7 civilians in Somalia, where they actually now say they investigated and they found that people killed were not al-Shabaab members. So themselves are also part of the problem. And that is the current situation in terms of the troop contributing countries to AMISOM, and also the complexities around the geopolitics in the region.
Thank you so much, Abdullahi. Do we have any last questions for the room? I think there's time for one more. Okay, Ria.
Thank you so much, panel, for such an informative session. My question is specifically directed to Abdullahi. So I wanted to know the other impacts of drone strike in a community, because there are civilians casualties, but there must be other impacts that are equally important and not even taken into consideration.
Of 30 seconds to address this very complex question.
Yeah, actually, thanks, Ria. And I think Camila also asked that same question. And it is something I mentioned in passing in my introduction. But that the U.S. military issues statements, and when they issue these statements, they say, apart from militarily supporting the Somali government to fight with al-Shabab, their aim is also to improve the economic development and peace building and in the country. That's what they say in their own statements. But then when they target family members who are not al-Shabab, who are the sole breadwinners for these families, when they attack farms, and in one incident I remember one man was killed in a farm, and the man was killed and the farm was also destroyed. It's a huge farm that provides for many people. So there is loss of livelihood in that process. And then almost all the people we interview or we speak to are people who are displaced as a result of this airstrike. So they are in IDP camps. So that is also another problem where people are living in fear and running away from their own houses. So all of this, if you combine all of them, then you would like to ask yourself, is the US military actually advancing economic development in Somalia, or are they achieving the goals they stated themselves in terms of degrading al-Shabab, or in terms of building a state for Somalia? So I think those are the questions we should ask, and I appreciate the question. That's very, very important. Thanks.
We are a minute over time, so we have to wrap this conversation up. It's been such a rich and informative discussion, and it feels like we could go on for so much longer. Thank you so much to all of our panelists who joined us both remotely from around the world and in person. Let's give them a hand for those of us here in person. Thank you, everyone. I've placed in the Zoom chat for our online audience some selected writings from our panelists. And for those of you who are here in person, I'll be tweeting those out later today so that you can also take a look at those to learn more about this topic. There's a lunch on your way out. And thank you so much to everyone who's joined us both online and in person. Thank you.